Can you all hear me okay? Lovely. Hello. Fellow Faber poets Larkin and Hughes shared a mutually respectful, albeit begrudging at times, literary relationship. The pair would often write to one another, and they did meet on multiple occasions, with Hughes often being hosted by Larkin here in Hull, quite a few times actually. Both would acknowledge their differences on occasion, both creatively and aesthetically, with Larkin describing Hughes as a great thug of a man, and Hughes calling Larkin a sour old cuss. It's often been considered a polite rivalry, I suppose, between that of the rationalist and the shaman. So it's actually documented in the Hull History Centre archives that Hughes delivered at least 3 poetry readings at the university, one in late 1962, another on the 30th of May 1975, and one on the 25th of October 1979. The final one being a reading that Larkin actually commented on as needing to make sure to be away for that evening to avoid Hughes. And the following framed picture that I'm sure a lot of you will have seen by now, it's not even my favourite one. It's like the following famed picture that hung above the toilet cistern in Larkin's bathroom is from the 1975 reading. Radiating shamanic sexual magnetism, James Booth writes, Hughes stands mid-stage whilst Larkin sits inscrutably at a table to the side. Larkin later commented that we had the old crow over at Hull recently, looking like a Christmas present from Easter Island. And he's all right when he's not reading. He filled our hall and got a great reception. I was in the chair providing a sophisticated, insensate and gold watch-chained alternative to his primitive, forthright, leather-jacketed persona. He'd send a copy of the terribly funny picture to Faber editor Charles Monteith at the time, with a letter stating that us Faber authors must stick together. Now, it wouldn't be the only photograph of the pair captured together at the university, with the following picture making the cover of the January 1987 cover of the London Review. And it was captioned at the time, Larkin extends a very wary welcome to the future poet laureate Ted Hughes during a visit paid by Hughes to the Brynmor Jones Library in Hull. In fact, Hughes was often spotted roaming the university's campus on multiple occasions across the 1970s. He was hard to miss, obviously, according to Larkin, anyway. Multiple University of Hull alumni have recalled often seeing Hughes walking along the Great White Way, which is just outside the main doors of Canham Turner, and straight past the library, which I didn't know about. And Larkin would often push Hughes around the library to chat to students, to take the focus off of him. Apparently that was quite a common occurrence. Larkin and Hughes shared a personal connection to Hull. Obviously, Larkin's is evident. But Hughes often visited the area, and in fact he completed his national service in Patrington, Holderness, about 30 minutes down the road from here. Now, it wasn't just the connection to this campus that the city that both poets shared. So Larkin and Hughes obviously experienced immense careers as post-war poets, with some of their earliest fictional writing being inspired by their Oxbridge education. So in this paper, I intend to look at the poets' undergraduate years ahead of their critical fame and prior to their meetings at Hull. And I'll argue that despite their opposing poetic styles, similarities can actually be found within the work that Larkin and Hughes produced during their time at university. In doing so, I hope to demonstrate that the post-war social class divides prevalent within Oxbridge in the 1940s and 50s shaped the work that Larkin and Hughes produced during a crucial moment in their development as poets. So Larkin would write Jill obviously between 1943 and 4, soon after graduating from his undergraduate studies at Oxford University and while studying English. So whilst Hughes's undergraduate experience was marginally impacted by the effects of post-war Britain, Larkin's was in fact affected by military service. So rationing was rife according to critics of the time, and lectures and tutorials were frequently punctuated by the sounds of bombers overhead. While the Blitz had not yet begun, Oxford colleges readied themselves in anticipation with fire buckets, sandbags, extinguishers, littering the immaculately tended quads, and with blackout curtains shrouding windows. Larkin did his bit for the war effort during this time, regularly fire watching at night in college. Larkin would later admit that he did in fact find the transition from grammar school to university quite challenging, and quote, "Oxford terrified me," Larkin recalled. "Public schoolboys terrified me. The Dons terrified me, and so did the Scouts." He could never shake his abiding sense of provincialism. Larkin would find solace in a small number of his close friends, and they created a group called the Seven. They met to drink, talk, and read one another's poetry. Larkin shared a similar distaste as Hughes for aspects of his English undergraduate course as well. Despite J.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis and Neville Coghill all being English dons at Oxford during the time, Larkin appears to have skipped most of their lectures. And he particularly disliked the Anglo-Saxon poetry and Chaucer that he was compelled to read. So Larkin would complete his undergraduate education and graduate from Oxford in 1943. The distillation of this experience would culminate in the publication of Jill. In a prefatory note in the novel, Larkin wrote about life at Oxford during this time as being austere. The war in Jill is in its second year, and as Larkin highlighted, conscription had begun with the 20s and upwards, but everyone knew that before long, the 19 and 18s would soon take their turn. Social class lines had blurred at this time, and Larkin had wrote that the men of one college would share a tutor with one another, who they would never normally see socially at all. Social differences were minimised under the backdrop of war and academic restriction in Larkin's time, but was certainly regained momentum when Hughes enrolled in Cambridge in 1951. And my favourite anecdote from this prefatory note that obviously Larkin wrote for Jill is the invention of the Yorkshire Scholar. So Larkin admits to having created this Yorkshire Scholar at university, and it's a character embodying many of our prejudices, as Larkin put it, that conversed in flat, rapacious tones, similar to that of the character Whitbread in Jill, who spoke, again, with a flat Yorkshire accent that made John suppose wrongly that he had a sense of humour. John could tell by his clothes that he was not well off, and he remembered a phrase from one of his mother's letters that said she hoped he had made some friends of his own standing. An uncanny caricature of a young Ted Hughes, perhaps. So, Hughes' time at Cambridge University. It's often been described as by critics, in a similar vein to Larkin's. It's quite a dissatisfying period for the poet. Hughes himself had declared Cambridge to be a prison from life. Hughes, like John Kemp in Jill, won an entrance exhibition in English in 1948, and following his 2 years of national service in Hull, he entered Pembroke College, Cambridge, in October of 1951, with the intention to study English literature. So following the end of the Second World War, it had become rather competitive to gain a place at university due to the need to reabsorb students like Ted, who'd been accepted at Cambridge but then had to go do military service or national service. Hughes had the full support and guidance at the time of his Mexborough Grammar School teacher, John Fisher, who is a relationship very reminiscent of Mr. Crouch and John Kemp's relationship in Jill. Hughes wrote extensively throughout his time at Cambridge, and this is evidenced within the extensive and quite untouched, actually, archives at Cambridge University Library. Yet it was clear that, like Larkin, he felt stifled by the rigidity of the university's English course during this period. Hughes didn't take too kindly to the closely analytic examination of text. Cambridge's English faculty's syllabus implied at the time, in which Hughes was an undergraduate, that literature after 1820 does not qualify for academic study. So this would rule out the majority of what Hughes later deemed to be his sacred canon, and this would be the work of T.S. Eliot, W.B. Yeats, proving too modern for Cambridge at that time. Hughes's contemporary, Neil Roberts, highlights the effect that this feeling of stiflement had on Hughes creatively. And when Hughes was at Cambridge, he was writing all the time, but what he wrote was just complete confusion. It wasn't that he wasn't writing, it was just that he was dissatisfied. And this dissatisfaction culminated in Hughes, like Larkin, rarely attending his lectures, favouring visits to the university library instead. Hughes appeared to have preferred his own readings to what was provided on the English Tripos syllabus in his first 2 years of study, commenting that the syllabus is too superficially wide and so much more a knowledge of opinions about literature than a real knowledge. Retreating to the university library, he devoted most of his time there to reading folklore and Yeats' poems. It is noted that Hughes was well aware of the class divisions that permeated the university, but Pembroke College hosted many other Northern Grammar School boys at that time. These students became a supportive circle of friends to Hughes and would ultimately develop into a reading, singing and drinking group called the Smart Set, obviously similar to Larkin's The Seven. Coming from the industrial frontier town of Mexborough, still recovering from the war, into the restoration fops and public school aesthetic of the wealthier students, Hughes felt comforted by his small group of poetry enthusiasts. Hughes's childhood was overshadowed by the First World War, whereas Hughes's father, on the right side there, just stood up, William Henry Hughes, served with the Lancashire Fusiliers, as well as at the beginning of the Second World War, his brother Gerald, on the left, far left there, he served in the RAF. The impacts that war had upon Hughes can be observed within his poetry, in poems like Dad's Music and the infamous Bayonet Charge. Hughes's dissatisfaction with the sterility of Cambridge's English syllabus ultimately led to Hughes abandoning his course in favour of studying archaeology and anthropology in his final year. This decision came to Hughes in a moment of crisis that presented itself in the form of, some of you may know, the infamous burnt fox dream that Hughes discusses in his later collection, Winter Pollen. So prior to this, for part one of the English Tripos, Hughes submitted a piece of writing in 1953, and it was titled The Eyewitness Account of a Poetry Reading in Throttle College, before the small poets grew up into infinitesimal critics. As part of the English course at Cambridge during Hughes's undergraduate years, students were permitted to submit an original composition that would be taken into consideration by the examiners, and if they were deemed to be of sufficient quality, they raised the students' degree class. The writing is a lengthy piece of prose fiction interspersed with large sections of verse that possess strong connections to the imagery and influences prevalent within Hughes's mature poetry. The typescript was praised at the time for its associations with Hughes's 1967 poetry collection Wadworth, when it was displayed at an exhibition at Cambridge in 2004. It is quite difficult when reading Hughes's contemporaries' recollections of their interactions with Hughes at Cambridge not to compare the setting of Hughes's Tripos submission to the circles in which Hughes moved as an undergraduate. The typescript satirises a group of small poets who would grow up into infinitesimal critics, gathering for a poetry reading. The title highlights Hughes's thoughts of the time regarding the relationship between poetry and criticism, writing that at Cambridge he felt deprived of a non-analytic language and a wholeness of language that proved a threat to Hughes's creative potential. The setting of the poetry reading at Throttle College, of friends gathering to discuss and write poetry, mimics Hughes's experience at Cambridge, where Hughes and his friends gathered at the Anchor, which is a local pub, quite popular with Cambridge students, to talk about politics and people they disliked. Hughes was at the very centre of his circle of friends, who would often meet with a little group of courtiers who gathered in his room. The names of the typescript's characters are themselves aptonyms. I'm going to struggle quoting these because they're very long and ridiculous. There's Dront, Farce Verse, Snatch Craftington. They are the hosts of this poetry reading, who are soon greeted by guests that include Miss Fluttermouth, Miss Strap Tankard, and Gleewit. Hughes subjects his characters to scathing ridicule from the onset, each aptonym relating to a stereotypical trait of academia that Hughes himself disapproved of. Hughes structures his tripos submission as lengthy prose fiction that is interspersed with long passages of verse as the characters take their turn reciting their poetry. As Hughes's characters begin to recite, the verse becomes more complex with each section. Hughes structures the submission into 7 chapters that coincide around each character's recitation. The first chapter concludes shortly after the first paragraph of Hughes's text, and as the recitations ensue, the chapters grow longer, very long. This leads on to the final chapter, and the first page of which has this handwritten note from Hughes appended to it that reads, "Everything beyond here is well outside the 5,000 limit." From here, all previous structure is abandoned as Hughes completes the final chapter with a 15-page long entanglement of verse. As the group begin to recite their poetry over one another, in the conclusion to Hughes's tripos submission, we see the poetry reading come to a close, the group disperse for the evening, and our opening characters, Dront, Farce Verse, and Snatch Craftington, are sat alone once again, repeating the opening scene. Hughes appears to be suggesting a similarity between the poetry reading and the cycle of university life, of promising poets progressing to infinitesimal critics following graduation. The scene, to me, is very much reminiscent of the persistent gatherings of Warner's group in Kemp and Warner's shared room throughout Jill. Hughes and Larkin's descriptions of both dorms are also very similar, with Hughes writing that even fewer than their full number could never keep the room warm. It is a cold room, for it is very large, and besides, it faces north, in a room crowded with armchairs and the gas fire. Whilst Larkin writes of a large room with a big fire, comfortable furniture, though it was not a very cosy room. It was commonplace at both Oxford and Cambridge for groups to gather in the main dorm room, and in the case of Hughes's tripos piece, share stories, poems, and obviously drink. Hughes's contemporaries recall that dorm meetings were very frequent, although Hughes never shared his poetry with his peers at this time. Back to the picture. Both poets wittily encapsulate Oxbridge undergraduate life in their own respective writing styles, with echoes of their mature work encapsulated in both pieces. Larkin's Jill is shaped by the poet's marked experience of austerity and restriction in wartime Oxford, highlighting within Larkin's later poetry on the same subject, Dockery and Son, Larkin's use of colloquialism and dry humour, most significantly when focusing on Whitbread's character, demonstrates that the poet's profound capability to write precisely about the mundanity of human experience was crafted in his youth. Larkin provides the reader with a detailed insight into the class differences and social challenges one may have faced during wartime Oxford, where, in Larkin's witty manner, the ongoing war becomes irrelevant when compared to the social rancour of university life. In a similar vein to Jill, Hughes's tripos submission highlights some of the common themes that can be located within Hughes's mature poetry, particularly surrounding nature and violence. A direct example of this is the character Gleewit's idea of man meeting the beast halfway and beating him back into a new obedience, not to be overtaken in full flight the other way, and knocked down and devoured. The line highlights Hughes's argument on humanity's connection to nature becoming severed as a result of a lack of an inward connection. Hughes argues that we must meet the beast halfway to reconnect with our inner consciousness. There is imagery throughout the submission that highlights themes surrounding nature and violence. An example of this is a poem on page 15 of the manuscript that contains direct allusions to Hughes's later poetry. In the tripos submission, Hughes writes of swallows, white-bellied and blue-finned, terrible steel, predator ricochets, that are twisting and whetting their barbs in their haste and retempering their harpoon blue in the sun's blast. In his later poem Skylarks, Hughes writes of a whippet's head, barbed like a hunting arrow. Its feathers thrash, its heart must be drumming like a mortar. The visualisation of nature here is violent and symbolically associates the birds in both poems as mechanically controlled and barbed. It is, as the accompanying caption as to the tripos submission relays, a foreshadow of the vision of a bleak, violent and enduring natural world familiar from Hughes's mature work. The tripos submission also presents imagery that Hughes would include within his first publication, The Hawk in the Rain. Yvonne Reddit notes the connection between Miss Fluttermouth's poem and a line within Hughes's The Hawk in the Rain poem, Wind. Miss Fluttermouth's poem describes the wind that was one nigh terrible and alive as a mad hand. Then, in Wind, the mad hand is reworked to become a mad eye. It is evident, therefore, that Hughes later reused previous lines of poetry from his tripos submission, and that both Wind and The Fort Fox, poems published within The Hawk in the Rain, were being worked on shortly after Hughes had left Cambridge. Despite their opposing poetic styles, occasional distaste for one another, and generally contrasting in every other way possible, it is interesting that Hughes and Larkin, to me, would align on their shared hatred for the Oxbridge syllabus. Perhaps it is the nature of a poet's creative mind to avoid academic restriction or just a pure stroke of luck that this would force the juvenile poets towards their own readings at university and ultimately lead them onto the creative path. It would lead both poets to meeting, as previously stated, on multiple occasions at this university. And in relation to this, I'd just like to end with a brief glimpse at a review of Hughes's reading at the university in late 1962. So this was left in the university's student paper of the time, Torchlight. And I'll just quote briefly. Last Tuesday, Ted Hughes came all the way from Devon to read some of his poems and give comments on them. The comments were disappointing. Generally, his work was just simply descriptive and reflective, concerned with life as seen and enjoyed through nature. It was not inhibited by any literary perspective. At the other end of the spectrum, he descends to what seems to be a very superficial treatment of what perhaps is a very superficial subject, worthy at the most of Michael Frayn. The review possesses a certain Larkinian wit and insight into Hughes that, given the poet's use of a pseudonym whilst at Oxford University, makes me wonder whether Larkin's time as an undergraduate influenced the writing that he perhaps produced during his beyond his poetry. But I'll leave that suggestion up for debate. Thank you.